Hello and welcome back to another edition of GNAT TV's In-Depth series. I'm Andrew McKeever, the news director here at GNAT TV's News Project, and it's a pleasure to have you with us today. It's also a real pleasure to be joined here in the studio by two gentlemen who are well known to many of you, I'm sure. They have both had long and distinguished careers in law enforcement, both here in our immediate area and statewide as well. We're very pleased to have with us today Jim Baker, who is the former director of the Vermont State Police from 2006 to 2009. After that, he became the interim director of the Vermont Police Academy, and then the police chief in Rutland, and then served as the acting police chief in Manchester. After his retirement, he has served as a consultant with the International Association of Police Chiefs based in Washington, D.C. Jim, we're very happy to have you with us today.
Thank you, Andrew.
Michael Hall began his career in law enforcement as a constable right here in Sunderland back in 1979, if we can get into the math here a little bit. He then joined the Manchester Police Department in 1983 and worked his way up through the ranks to become the police chief in November of 2011 and retired this past June. Mike, real pleasure to have you with us today as well.
Thank you.
Anyway, gentlemen, really good to have you here because to have you reflect a little bit on your careers in police work and law enforcement. And I guess just to get us started, I thought it'd be interesting to kind of get your reactions to how has work in policing and law enforcement changed over the past 35 or 40 years since when you first began. And Jim, we'll let you, I'll pick on you first. Tell us.
Thanks for picking on me first, Andrew. I appreciate that.
How has the job changed in the big picture over the past?
It's changed drastically. I mean, it's not, I started in 1978 with the state police as a road trooper here in Bennington County. And first of all, the technology. And, my first cruiser had a radio in it and a rotating blue light on the roof, and you had 4 channels on the radio. And you look inside a police car today, it's got a computer system, camera system, high band radios with multiple channels that tie you into law enforcement, EMS, fire, and that's just the equipment. I started with a .357 revolver on my hip, and I left the state police with, a 40 caliber semi-automatic pistol on my hip. That's just the equipment. I think the biggest change, Andrew, is centered around law enforcement today is really a social service and delivery system. And people struggle with that. It's the reality of it. I'm not saying I agree with it, disagree with it. But clearly the issues around mental health, the opiate crisis, these issues when no one else can fix the problem. And it's 1 o'clock in the morning, a family struggling with someone that's got a mental health issue, and they can't get anybody else on the phone. They're calling the police departments, be it the state police or Manchester PD, or, I don't think that looks any different around the country. When I was at IACP, we used to do yearly roundtable forums with law enforcement leaders around the country. Mental health issues and use of force were the 2 top issues that law enforcement executives talked about. And that's very challenging for leaders in law enforcement today to manage those issues.
Mr. Hall, what's your takeaway on how things have changed?
I'd have to echo what the Colonel said. One of the things that I found primarily over the last 10 years primarily is the increase in the mental health issues. And, things aren't too bad from a law enforcement perspective Monday through Friday, 8 to 4:30. Because you have generally a host of available resources, whether it be mental health or counseling people to some degree. That's not when the majority of these problems happen. It's generally on a Saturday afternoon at 4:30 and or 9:30 at night. And we struggle with that because as law enforcement officers, we're pretty adapted to dealing with almost every kind of situation. But as in any case, when you're dealing with people in a mental health crisis, you're not dealing with how normal people think and react. So those things can turn sideways very quickly. I think given what we have for resources on a local level, we do very well. We certainly need to take a look at where we're going down the road because, in my opinion, the numbers are going up. The number of calls for service where people are in a mental health crisis are becoming pretty taxing on the agency to the point as where you have people in our community that, quite frankly, should probably be hospitalized, but aren't. And I'm not suggesting that they're all dangerous, but, if you look at what's happened around the country with some of the tragic events that have taken place, there certainly have been warning signs prior to that, and I think we're no different than that. We've got people that potentially could pose a risk that probably need more attention than what they're getting.
What attracted you both to careers in law enforcement way back in the beginning? Was there something about the job that really appealed to you? I mean, obviously there was. I guess what was that led you into the law enforcement field?
People ask me this a lot, and probably partially. Now we're going back to the mid-'70s, Andrew, right?
It's a long time ago.
I'm having a hard time remembering what I did yesterday. So going back to 1973 when I got out of high school, I from probably early on, 8th grade freshman in high school, was interested in law enforcement. And if you remember back then, because I know you do.
Yeah, sort of, vaguely.
There was a number of shows on TV that focused on police work and investigative. And
Right.
I was a big sports fan. I didn't watch a lot of other TV, but I tended to watch those shows. And then I grew up in a small town with a small police department, and my father was active in politics. And I got to know the local police chief really well, and I used to hang out with him, and, that had a big influence on me. And so I never had any other career in mind except for law enforcement. And I think it was probably the action, but I also feel like I've been a person that has a great deal of empathy, and so that also drew me to the career as well.
And Mike, how did you get involved in it all?
Well, I think the traits of most people that got into law enforcement during the time frame that we're talking about back in the early 70s had, certainly we were thrill seekers and people who liked challenges and excitement, but I also think that, a vast majority of us had a strong sense of commitment to the community that, we took personally what people did in our towns, and if somebody was doing something that was wrong or improper or illegal, we didn't like it and wanted to do something about it. And, I think that's pretty much the core of what law enforcement officers did then. I suspect it's probably the same now, but, I don't know of anybody that ever came into this profession for the money. It was all of being able to help people and do what you felt was the right thing. And, a lot of people get into law enforcement and find out it's not what they want. And, as the colonel can probably attest to, there's a fair high number of them that, in that 3 to 5 year period decide they want to do something different, and that's okay because, but.
Probably better to find that out at that point rather than do it much later. Which leads me to another question is, my understanding is that it's difficult or seemingly more difficult than it may have been in the past to recruit new members into the police departments or law enforcement in general here in Vermont. Is that the case? Is that your sense of it? And if so, what are some of the reasons around that, do you think?
So, Andrew, I think it's not only Vermont, but I know from my experience working at IACP, it's nationally. It's very difficult to fill policing positions, no matter where you are in the country. And you can follow some of this where, agencies that are struggling with public safety and crime control, numbers are down. There's a very famous guy, Bill Bratton, who was he created Broken Windows and Comstat, and he was the commissioner of New York twice in L.A. and I've often heard him say, and he still says it, police officers matter. Having police officers in a community to be able to enhance public safety and raise quality of life matter. And the agencies are struggling to find people. And when you peel the onion back and you get to why it is so difficult, my personal opinion is this. You asked a question earlier about how has policing changed. It's changed significantly. Back when I got hired, there were height limits. You had to be a certain height. You came in, in the state police, there was a famous saying, one riot, one trooper. It was expected to be that you could handle yourself. That's not policing today. Policing today is really about interpersonal skills and having a broader view of the world and understanding issues around mental health, for example, and addiction and family violence. So when you're recruiting for police officer today, you're not looking for somebody that is a boxing champion. You're looking for someone that's a well-rounded, well-educated, got a lot of experience, and that's who you're looking for as a police officer with a value system that matches what your needs are inside the police departments. And that's the same thing Amazon's looking for. It's the same thing Google's looking for. It's the same thing high-tech companies are looking for. And so that's what you're competing against. And so if I've got someone in front of me I'm interviewing, they've got a chance to go work for a high-tech company, working Monday through Friday with a very liberal attendance policy, can work from home. I roomed with someone in D.C. that worked for the Gates Foundation. They had unlimited annual leave. Or they can come work for the police department, work every holiday, get called out in the middle of the night, have guns pointed at them, potentially life-threatening situations. Their choices are they're going to work for someone else. And so it's very difficult to fill those vacancies in an agency. And I personally think that's part of what the issue is. And I saw it from the seat that I sat in D.C. across the country. They were challenged to recruit.
Mm. Was that your experience, Mike, with the Manchester Police Department? Was it when vacancies came up, was the talent pool sufficient, do you think, to find an officer that you felt, yeah, this is the guy I want?
Well, I think, one of the things on a local level versus, Manchester PD compared to, say, example, New York State Police. I think when I applied for the New York State Police back in, I'm going to say 1976, one of the lieutenants or one of the people there at the barracks right there and just outside of Troy told me I think they had like 10,000 applications. I mean, but again, it was, hiring time, applicants galore. I mean, I can remember when I worked at the PD as a young officer, if we had a position, you'd probably get maybe 50, 60 applicants, and they were generally local. Now when we advertise, we get a lot of applications because it's easy to hit the transmit button on the computer and apply to a number of different agencies. But when you boil that down to real prospective applicants, we're lucky if we have maybe 10. And, the thing used to be where you could have some local people that, like myself, I started out as a constable. I had somewhat of a proven track record working doing that, so agencies knew what they were going to hire. So on a real small Vermont basis, it wasn't bad or too hard to hire people because half of your job was pretty well done because if you didn't know them, you knew somebody who did, right, who could pretty much do that. That's not the case now. The folks that we're hiring are much more transient, and not to say that they can't do the job. I don't mean to imply that, but it makes it more difficult because you're also competing against wages like state police that are higher. So consequently, what I predict is going to happen, because the pool for police officers is very, very shallow. You're going to start seeing agencies poaching from other agencies because we can offer, sign-on bonuses. We can offer, better pay, better benefits. And, one of the things that I think really has made it difficult for local agencies is you become a training ground for other agencies. If I had the option as a police chief to hire somebody that maybe had 3 or 4 years experience on, that is much better for me to hire that person than it is to gamble on somebody that I don't know anything about. Right. But you also have to be in a position financially, benefit-wise and the like, to be able to, make those kind of offers. So it's going to be real interesting to see what happens down the road.
Boy, no kidding.
Let me just let me add to the chief's point, because I think when I was in Rutland, it was a matter of rebuilding a police department, right? And I poached officers. I mean, I went out, and I think the other side of this equation is it's one thing to hire people, it's another thing to retain people. And I think sometimes people may not realize just how tricky it is to be a law enforcement executive, right, running an agency. I don't care if you're the chief in Manchester in a small PD, because that's what American policing looks like, actually. Or you run the state police where you've got 300 some odd sworn personnel, is creating an environment that people feel like they're valued and they're making a difference, and making sure that their personal needs are taken care of. It's not easy to do that, and retaining people is as difficult as hiring people.
Mm-hmm. Well, one of the issues I know, and we talked about this before we went on the air, is the introduction of body cameras to police officers. I'm sure that's been a very controversial subject within the ranks. Now a police officer goes into a situation, turns on the body camera, and there's a video record of what happens. I gather there's a lot of mixed feelings about whether or not that's a good idea or not. And I wondered if both of you could talk a little bit about what your sense of the pluses and minuses are of the use of body cameras, because I'm sure there's a fair amount of both. Mike, what is your sense of those?
Well, I think that they're a good tool. I wouldn't want to suggest that they're not, but I think there's so many issues before we get to that level where we really decide that we're going to implement them unilaterally across agencies, and I'm not sure that how that would happen. As we spoke earlier, there's storage costs, which are a major factor for larger agencies, but also what I would have concerns about is who has access to that information and under what circumstances. Basically, if you think about plugging a recorder on an individual, whether it be a police officer or, a mailman or somebody that works at Home Depot, and you're going to make available 24-hour, 8-hour days or whatever they work, available of everything that person was exposed to or whatever, there may be things that, they may go into private homes during the course of an investigation. Does that open that up to public discovery? One of the other things is we talk to a lot of people every day that have nothing to do with anything. That's part of the community policing, is we're talking to individuals. And, sometimes people gossip and make stupid statements and tell you things that aren't true. And those are the kind of things that, okay, just because it's on tape doesn't mean it's true because this guy said it or that person said it. So, I get it in critical incidents where, more information is better, but I think we need to be really careful about how far we expand that out. And, and like anything else, there's going to be failures. If guys get a hot call and they forget to turn the video on, which is going to happen because your mind is someplace else, doesn't mean that they did anything wrong. It just means that they didn't turn the stupid thing on. But try telling that to a defense attorney.
Right.
And I get where they're coming from. I get it, but a lot of issues with that.
Put a little context to what the chief was talking about, right? So, really, body cameras in the country came about as a result of the Ferguson affair, and
the issue in Missouri
with Michael Brown, and again, going back to my days at IACP, for 3 years I had a front seat to this unfolding nationally, and to a certain degree internationally. Body cameras came about because political figures started talking about nationally that by putting body cameras on police officers and capturing everything they're going to do, that you're going to modify the behavior of police officers. And that was the conversation. And like a lot of things that happen politically, and policies start happening, not well thought out. And again, I think body cameras are a very useful tool. And I do think it adds to the credibility of the police department in the community. There are things that are going to happen on body cameras that sometimes, taken out of context, look worse than what really happened on the ground. A physical altercation between a police officer and an individual is never a pretty affair. Never is. And sometimes physical force has to be used to detain, restrain, protect others from a situation. So, I watched as the body cameras came out, and early on, body cameras were put out in the field without any type of understanding about what the chief was talking about, policy, right? And when do you have the body camera on, when don't you have the body camera on? And I think, like everything else, those policies are starting to evolve, and policies that fit Manchester Police Department, chances are that policy's not going to fit the way New York City Police Department operates. And think about rolling out body cameras to 37,000 police officers in New York City. It's not as simple as it sounds. And then you get into the storage issues. I was aware of and part of a couple studies that were done, one by George Washington University in DC, where they studied the effects of body cameras on officers' behavior. And there is no scientific proof, research-based proof, that they do in fact affect the behavior of police officers. Now, I will say that when I worked on the road as a road trooper, what preceded body cameras were in-car camera systems. And I think, and I can say this, now that I'm removed from this, but probably if there were in-car cameras in cruisers back when I was a road trooper and I was an aggressive trooper on the road, probably some of that stuff I would not want to replay in front of my mother, you know what I mean? So I do think to a certain degree that technology helps. But I think where the problem came nationally, and still to a certain degree, people expected those body cameras to be 100% accurate all the time and tell the whole story. And sometimes they don't tell the whole story, and they don't give true context to what was going on at a given scene. And in those cases, without a real good relationship between the leadership of a police department and their community, it will inflame the relationship with the police department and the community. And at the end of the day, police departments serve the communities they belong to, and it's a law enforcement executive's obligation to make sure that the folks under her or his command are meeting the needs of what the community expects of that police department. So.
Well, let me pivot to another question that has emerged, and you sort of mentioned it a bit in your last answer there, the situation in Ferguson, Missouri with Michael Brown, the young man who was shot by a police officer out there. And that's the whole use around deadly force. When is that justified? When is that appropriate? When is that questionable? And I guess what I'm interested in hearing a little bit is what sort of training and background goes into preparing a police officer to understand how to handle a situation where they're walking into something and they really don't know what might be, at the end of the road here. I mean, obviously it's a very stressful kind of job in general, but then you find yourselves occasionally in these situations where you don't know the person you're dealing with, what they're capable of doing, or you have a good suspicion that maybe they're carrying a weapon and they're not exactly perhaps as mentally coherent as you would like. What training does an officer get to say, okay, this is how I can de-escalate a situation, or okay, this is the red line here, and now I've got to draw my gun? Is there some training that I'm sure there obviously must be training that officers get? And what is that?
So I think this is another situation in law enforcement where training has evolved. And again, my frustration, and when I hear people that don't understand the inner workings of a police department, and I'm talking about a well-run police department, do not understand that leaderships of organizations are constantly looking at the way they do business. I mean, it's like any other business. You're delivering a product to the public. It happens to be the stakes are a lot higher. There is no one in society that carries the kind of authority a police officer carries, which is you can take away people's constitutional rights and you can take their life. And, going back to the body cameras for a minute, ties into this. You tell me another profession where every minute of what you do is videotaped. Doesn't happen in the medical profession. It doesn't happen on an airplane when a pilot's carrying a plane, with 150 passengers on board. It doesn't happen in the dentist office. You tell me another profession that's scrutinized like that. And on the issue of deadly force, the training has evolved, Andrew. Back in the day, when I was a road trooper and you got called for a disturbance, you didn't wait for backup. You didn't step back and try to contain a situation. You just went in and dealt with it. And back then, you didn't have the kind of issues you have around mental health that you have now. And these situations are very challenging. One of the things that I did when I was in DC at IACP is I did a project internally where we were tracking police officer-involved shootings around the country. The Washington Post had been running stories on it, and they to this day have a database. A third of the shootings involving police officers involve mental health calls. And so as a advocacy organization, IACP started taking a look at that. And the training now is emerging. I mean, there's several very well-established training programs out there now where it's contained in distance. You don't run it, and it doesn't have to be a firearm. I mean, somebody can have a shovel in their hand, and it could be deadly. A knife can be deadly. A rock can be deadly. But if you're close enough that that person can use that rock as a weapon against you, that's going to escalate the situation. So the training has evolved from running into the situation and containing it to stepping back and containing it, almost like you're dealing with someone that's having some type of seizure. Protect the area, step back, try to negotiate, try to contain, try for them not to harm themselves or anybody else, and try to negotiate with them. Well, sometimes that works and sometimes that doesn't work. And, I think that training's evolved, and I think it's going to continue to get better. But there's some situations, and, if you remember the case that happened about 3 weeks ago in Texas, I mean, it was a state trooper stopped the car and immediately opened up fire. And this guy went on a shooting rampage that killed, 12, 14 people. I mean, you can't contain a situation like that. And, eventually, force was used, and the situation was resolved. So it has evolved. I think it'll continue to evolve, and I think police departments are getting better at it. But the number of involved officer shootings in Vermont, I would have never thought we'd see the number of officer-involved shootings that we see now. I know when I was a colonel of state police, I had 2 officer-involved fatal shootings. It seems like there's one every other month now. And so that's a very challenging situation for police departments.
Yeah, and certainly those who've never been in that situation, hard to relate to or
Absolutely.
identify with that, because all of a sudden you have to make a snap, instant decision.
Absolutely.
In what's already a very stressful situation. Chief Hall, did you have to wrestle with some of that as well during your time there?
Sure. Well, as we talked coming into the program here, a lot of things have changed over the years. And, back when I came on, you didn't have 95-pound police officers that were 5 foot. You didn't have people that were probably physically challenged to be able to lift their own body weight. And, some of those things come with the changing of times and whatever. When I got hired, you hired guys because of their size and their ability to do what needed to be done if they had to manhandle somebody. So, the training today that these folks are taking on is probably somewhat different in the sense that, and I've said it, I have officers on my department that when I was running the PD, great people, but I would not expect them to go up against a 6'4" rugby player in a fist fight. It's just not going to happen. So they've got tasers, they've got chemical sprays, they've got mace, whatever the case may be. And the one thing that I really emphasized to the staff at the department when I was there is always look at other alternatives to what you have. And some of those alternatives may be to back off and fight this fight under your terms. Always try to pick the battleground under your terms if you can. And to some extent, as a society, we've taken that away from law enforcement. And I'll give you an example. Back when I started on the PD, we had a lot of domestics. Not so much anymore, probably for a number of reasons. But we had a lot of domestics. But I can't tell you how many times that we would get a guy who was arrestable. He was going to get arrested, but it was a Saturday night. He was liquored up. It was 11 o'clock, and we knew that if we went there, because the victim had left, that we were going to arrest him, but we were going to do it under our terms. Today, there's this urgency where we got to go arrest this guy. And rightfully so, because the mindset is, well, what if he does something else? So, in some cases, we're expecting law enforcement. We're putting people into situations that probably are not going to have a good end result. And I think from a administrative standpoint, that is something that the administration has to focus and train into the employees that, listen, sometimes it's okay not to do anything, and fight this battle under your terms on your time. And, the public may not understand that, and the police may get criticized for doing that. But you know what? If it turns out better, it was worth it. And I understand that if it goes sideways and something bad happens, that you're going to take some heat for it. But we're talking about now where we're issuing extreme protection orders, and there's a lot of things that are happening out there today that didn't necessarily happen 25 or 30 years ago. We're going up, taking a guy or a woman or whatever, and we're throwing them out of their house and giving them an order saying you can't contact your kids, you can't do this, you can't do that. For the average person, they don't like it and they can deal with it. But to some of people out there, you've just taken away my kingdom and my family, and I'm not a happy camper. And if that person is a little fragile to begin with, that's typically where these things don't go well. And I'm not suggesting that we don't do our jobs. It's just I think we need to stop feeling pressured to the points to where we find ourselves doing things that we probably wouldn't have done if we could have made our own decisions. And I think that needs to come from the administration.
Right, right. Well, complicated job. Sounds like it's getting more and more complicated all the time.
Absolutely.
That mental health piece is really fascinating. We could probably talk for another half an hour just on that subject alone, but looks like we're going to have to run here. But I just wanted to thank you again, both Colonel Jim Baker and Chief Michael Hall, for being with us today to talk a little bit about their experiences in one of the arguably most important jobs that there is out there, keeping the peace and keeping everything under control. Thank you all as well for being with us today. Hope you've enjoyed the show, found it interesting, and we'll see you again the next time. Have a great day.